Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. People are still trickling in, so we'll give it another minute for folks to join us. In the meantime, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your pronouns, and your city or where you're calling in from, we can start to get a sense of who's here with us. And we do have interpretation available. This presentation will be given in English, and we have Reina interpreting into Spanish. So please use the controls to change your channel, and she will be there interpreting the presentation. We will start in just a minute.
Maida, Yvette is saying that whatever link she's using is requiring a passcode. I don't know if there's a way for you to send her a new link that wouldn't require that.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're letting people start to trickle in here. We will begin shortly. This will also be live streamed on the Facebook All of Us or None page. If you have folks that want to join through there, there is interpretation that is available in Spanish in the language options. So please choose your channel so that you can listen to the presentation in your preferred language. In the meantime, if you can please introduce yourself with your name, pronoun, and city that you're calling from so that we can get to know who's on the call today, that would be great. Thank you all. Okay, so we will go ahead and get started here. Welcome to everybody. Wanted to give you just a run through of some Zoom logistics and a disclaimer that we are prioritizing cybersecurity during this event, and we'll be removing anybody who non-consensually shares anything visually or verbally vulgar or inappropriate. We want to create a space where people can be safe and can ask questions, and this is an educational environment, so we're here to all learn together. During the presentation, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and share them via the chat or the Q&A function. And my colleague Rosa will be monitoring the chat. So when we'll have time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions, the panelists will be able to answer your questions. You can also do reactions. You can share reactions with the reaction tool. Just a reminder that we do have interpretation in Spanish. Reina is our interpreter and she's waiting in the Spanish channel. So if you need to listen to this presentation in Spanish, please choose your language options now. So today we will be talking about the alternatives to incarceration and what that we'll learn about the campaign that was run in Los Angeles by the organizers who made it happen on the ground. And we will then talk about what that means for Kern County or could mean for Kern County as well. We'll start with an introduction of our local partners here in Kern County in just a minute. We will talk about why alternatives to incarceration is important in a place like Kern County. We'll go into our policing and carceral system just a little bit, just to give some grounding and context to today's conversation. And then we will jump into the main educational information that we're all here for, which is Alternatives to Incarceration campaign in LA, how it happened, how the organizers made it happen. We'll start with some introductory data to set up the context for that. And then we'll dive into some history of LA's carceral system and the continued efforts, that continue on even now to change the landscape there, and how we can use data to support and advance alternative to incarceration and those goals. And we'll end with some lessons learned from national efforts. Then we will have some time for questions and answers. So you can always share them during the presentation if they pop up, and then we'll address them during this section. And we'll end with a call to action so that everybody is aware of how you can plug into this work and how you can start advancing conversations and local initiatives towards alternatives to incarceration here in Kern County. So I'll do a quick I'll just start calling the Bakersfield partners as I see them on my screen to do a quick intro for you guys so you all get a feel of who is here on the call locally and a little bit about them. So we'll start with Yusidra. Yusidra, I can't hear your audio. It's not working. While we wait for Yusidra to sort her audio, we will, I'll invite Josh to introduce himself.
Yes. Hey, everybody. Can you hear me? Good. Josh Stenner. I work with an organization called Faith in the Valley. Those are my little dogs in the back that are fighting. Great timing. And yeah, I'm just a community organizer out here.
Thank you, Josh. And Dalton, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, my name is Dalton Jones. I work with Josh at Faith in the Valley, and I'm a community organizer.
Thank you, Josh. Yusidra, are you able to connect to audio?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Jasidra Osby. I'm president of All of Us in Bakersfield. And I'm so thankful that you guys are joining in today. We're doing a lot of awesome work and starting this conversation of rethinking mass incarceration and providing alternatives to that. So stay tuned. Thanks.
Thank you all. So I actually, Yusidra, if you want to unmute yourself again and introduce us, set some context around why we are discussing alternatives to incarceration in Kern County today.
Thank you. We're discussing alternatives to mass incarceration today because Kern County is severely impacted by mass incarceration. We are home to 9 institutions within a 30-mile radius, um, and we have little to no resources or tools for our reentry population when they're coming home into our community. I'll give you some personal history. I am formerly incarcerated, and I was born into a family of people who were formerly incarcerated dating back as far as the 70s, right here in Kern County. And so I know that in order for me to do a 180, I needed to reach outside of where I live, which is Kern County, in Bakersfield, to get what I needed in order to learn how to adapt to being outside and to raise my level of success here in Kern County. And so now I am here to help others who have been incarcerated and or system impacted because they have family who have been incarcerated here in Kern County. We spend billions of dollars and approximately $13 billion budget incarcerating people. Like, how ridiculous is that? Like, we have to find another way to deal with our issues. We have to provide alternatives. We tried mass incarceration. It didn't work. And when something doesn't work, you have to have conversations about that. Be honest with yourself and say it didn't work. Let's try something else. So I'm totally excited that you guys are here today and wanting to learn what happened in LA County and how we can do that right here in our own home, Kern County.
Thank you, Yusidra. Just to add to what Yusidra shared, one other reason that we are here having this conversation is because in our county, we're really up against a narrative of law and order, a narrative that tells us that we need to be investing in police force heavily because we have a lot of high and violent crimes. However, what we've seen through data that is available is that actually what's happening is that there's a criminalization of poverty and mental illness and substance abuse. We see some of the figures are that 24% of the arrests based on data from 2010 to 2016, 24% of those arrests were for possession of drugs or paraphernalia. 11% were for failure to appear, 8% suspended license. None of these falling into this, what this narrative creates, that is that there are a lot of violent people running around our county, and this is why we need to heavily invest in law enforcement to so yes, so just adding that our goal here is to better understand how we as a community can step forward and start to combat these narratives and start to take on the work of community investment and prioritizing in what we actually need, which is community care. Josh or Dalton, do you have anything you want to add to ground the conversation?
Yeah, I think it's important to also mention that on top of the incarceration data that we found and the criminalization of poverty, we also have very heavy-handed police here. We just wrapped up an investigation on the sheriff's department regarding patterns and practices of constitutional violations of rights, essentially, which was a really long process. Essentially, we have a huge history of excessive police brutality in our own backyard. And so it's not just the criminalization of poverty, but also the violence that is caused and funded disproportionately to when you compare it to the systems that are put in place in our communities to heal people and to help them re-enter society and help them, humanize our neighbors. So I think that's important to also talk about.
Thank you. So now we'll open it up to our panelists. We have a handful of panelists that will be presenting from the Alternatives to Incarceration campaign in Los Angeles that will be helping us understand how this campaign went and what we can learn as well. So Danielle, if you want to start, I'll go ahead and share your data.
Sure. We can just start with the first slide, and I'll say next slide when I'm ready to move on. Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Dupuy. I am the Executive Director of $1 Million Hoods. I'm also the Director of Research and Programs for the Ralph J. Bunche Center of African American Studies at UCLA. And I represent $1 Million Hoods on the Justice LA E-Team E-Board. Yeah. And, just a little bit about my background to know me a bit. I have family, friends throughout my whole life who have been impacted by policing and incarceration. And it wasn't until probably about 10 years ago that I realized I really wanted to step into the space and use my skills in public health and data to do something more here. And so I found myself in LA as a part of the $1 Million Hoods team. And what I'm going to do today is really share some of the data that helped move ATI along. But I think before I present the data, it's really important to set the tone about what this data is. And I think it's common when data is presented to think that the data itself is a driving force to some outcome or result, which in many instances it can be, but in this instance, it is not the only thing that helped move the needle or move progress forward. I mean, in fact, as many of you know, and what Lex and Yvette will talk about soon, is that the fight against the carceral system in Los Angeles began way before this data was ever produced that I'm about to show you. So it actually came as a result of the fight. So the community's organizing is what led to this data being produced. It was the LA community organizations that saw the need for data analysis from a community perspective, because we know that data is often presented from a law enforcement perspective. And they made the ask, and it was UCLA professor Kelly Lytle Hernandez who helped garner the philanthropic support and university support to respond to the community's ask. So I think it's really important to just say that the data that I'm about to present to you is very community driven, but it's university based. And that is part of the story about how the university can and should lend its reputation, especially amongst law enforcement folks, to add legitimacy to the narrative that the community already knows is true, right? So a lot of the data that we produced here is something that community members already knew about. And it was able to shed light to something they had been saying for years. So what the data is going to show, and what the community always knew, is that Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities were hit hardest by policing and incarceration. And it was those people that were most vulnerable, that were often caged for reasons that many countries don't even see as a crime, like we said, for poverty, really. So this data really helped remove the ability to deny what the community said was true. So since about 2017, $1 Million Hoods has put out numerous reports and memos about policing and incarceration in Los Angeles. They've covered topics such as houselessness, bail, cannabis, race, youth, and of course costs, which is a major part of the story. But there are probably 3 data tools and reports that contributed most towards the movement to alternatives to incarceration. It was the web-based interactive maps that Million Dollar Hoods put out, and I'm about to show you. It was a rapid response report, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And the third tool was really what is called a white paper. It was a more comprehensive view of jail data in Los Angeles County. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the first thing that Million Dollar Hoods put out and what the community asked for was really to document the costs of incarceration by neighborhood. And this is really taking a page from the book of Million Dollar Blocks, which initiated out of New York. There's also a similar project in Chicago, but it really, the idea came from someone who was incarcerated and was saying, you know, I think it's just a handful of neighborhoods that really make up the majority of the incarcerated population. How much do we spend really targeting those neighborhoods? So Million Dollar Hoods, we put a map together, pulling both LAPD and LA Sheriff's Department data to say, which neighborhoods do we spend the most policing incarcerating people? And what we can do is we ranked them, right? So these show a 6-year span from 2012 to 2017. And where are the neighborhoods that you spent at least over $1 million are those that are highlighted in red. You can also see some charges, race, and gender when you look at these maps. So it was a tool that was available to everyone. It is a tool that is available to everyone and really helped put pressure on supervisor districts too. It's saying, oh, okay, my neighborhood is really hard hit by incarceration and policing, which I already knew, but how much are we spending on just locking up my constituents, right? So that was part of that story. And I think was one of the tools that helped make us get closer towards the Alternatives to Incarceration work group and initiative. We can go to the next slide. The second tool, I think, is a rapid response report. Now, Million Dollar Hoods puts out multiple rapid response reports, again, based on issues highlighted by community members. And this one, Women in Los Angeles County Jail, was published in January 8th, 2019. The Alternatives to Incarceration work group was established in February, okay? But what this report did was help the community advocate to stop the building of a new women's jail, okay? And so one of the biggest things that came out of that, and I'm gonna present a few data points from there, but one was the cost. And they said, we said that Los Angeles County spends at least $750 million locking up women only, for this 7-year period, okay? And that's over $100 million a year, right? And so that's what you're doing. And what does that mean? Now, some people like law enforcement or people who don't really agree with the narrative of decarceration, they think that, oh, there's reasons for that, right? It's because people are, as was stated before, they're committing more violent crimes, they're a hazard to public safety, these types of things. But some of the data that we showed broke down that rhetoric. We can go to the next slide. So one thing we showed was that racial inequities were absolutely abhorrent in the Los Angeles County jail system and the policing and incarceration of women. And we'll see this similar statistic no matter which way you run the data in terms of racial inequities. What this bar graph shows is the proportion of the female population in LA County by race. Those are the blue bars. And then the proportion of the female population in LA County by race, and those are the orange bars. Now, while we don't want anyone really to be incarcerated here, what racial equity would mean is that the bars would be about the same level, right? But what we see is that Black women are disproportionately incarcerated in LA County relative to the population. Although they make up 9% of the population, The population of Black women in LA County Jail is actually 33%, right, during this time. And Latina women made up the majority of the incarcerated female population. So these were some of the outstanding statistics that we highlighted in this report. The next slide. So back to the narrative that these are violent and dangerous crimes that are being committed. When we ran the numbers about charges, women were being locked up for majority nonviolent offenses and for offenses that were indicative of poverty, substance abuse, things of that nature. So possession of a controlled substance was the most common charge that women were incarcerated for in LA County. Driving on a suspended license or with no insurance, theft or shoplifting, failure to appear, which if you don't have a car, it's hard to show up for court, and DUI, right? So these made up about 40-something% of women who were booked into LA County Jail over this time period. And, you know, it kind of really, again, flew in the face of the narrative of violence and all of that was coming from law enforcement, and really compelled the Board of Supervisors to think differently about this entire thing. Now, one piece of data that was not produced, that was not shown in our report, but was communicated to the Board of Supervisors was the number of days in jail that the women spent. So not only are we spending a ton of money to lock up women for nonviolent charges, but we're incarcerating them for, on average, about a week. So 50% of the women locked up during this time were incarcerated for a week or less. For what? What does that solve, right? And that was part of the conversations that we were having. So the next slide. So the third tool that I think really made a difference in the alternatives to incarceration is the white paper that we put out. And this is the only white paper Million Dollar Hoods has ever put out. And what a white paper is just a bit more of an extensive look into the data. It's more pages than most of our reports. Most of our reports are about 1 to 2 pages. This one, I think, was about 15 pages. And it really took a comprehensive look at all of the demographics in LA County Jail, looked at them like 5 different ways, right? So as you'll notice, the Alternatives to Incarceration work group had already been started when this came out, but this was requested by the work group as to help them make decisions about how to move forward. And some of the things that this report talked about included, and it's in the next slide, we did a lot of trends, like how have things changed over time between 2010 and 2016. We talked about the houseless population and how there was an increasing policing of houseless folks in Los Angeles County. We didn't just break down charges, right? The top charges, we said top charges by race and sex. So both for men and women by race, what were the top charges? And they were mostly the same over that time period. Most of them were the ones that I listed in the previous slide. And then the largest proportion of bookings by supervisor district and by neighborhood. The geography element always hits home. I think cost, of course, was a big part of the conversation. And then days in jail was also a large part of the report. And I think another piece that's important here is that although the Alternatives to Incarceration work group started in 2019, this data covered the period of 2010 to 2016. So even though you may not have access to the most current data in your municipality, doesn't mean it can't help inform decision-making, right? So it was about 3 years prior that this data was being looked at and being used to inform decisions. I know there are some barriers to accessing current data. Of course, you know, law enforcement holds the key to getting that data. So sometimes you might experience challenges with that, but I just want to say that even if you have a couple years back, it should still make a difference. With that being said, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Lex and Yvette.
Thank you so much, Danielle. For folks that I'm not familiar with on the call, my name's Yvette Ale. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the senior policy lead with Dignity and Power Now, one of the members of Justice LA's executive body. And I'll hand it over to Lex to introduce himself.
Hi, thank you, Yvette, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy that everybody's here to have this conversation and to really begin building together. It's long overdue and really exciting for us and meaningful. My name is Lex Stepling. I'm the Director of Policy and Campaigns at Dignity and Power Now here in Los Angeles. And like Yvette said, one of the anchor organizations of the Justice LA campaign.
Thanks, Lex. And on a personal note, I also want to share, like many of the folks on our team, we've been impacted by incarceration. I'm the child of a formerly incarcerated person. I'm a formerly undocumented person, and my family has systemically suffered from houselessness, substance use, and mental health needs that have gone unmet. I'm also a survivor of violence, and domestic violence specifically, and sexual assault. And what really brings me to the work is the position of both being someone that's impacted by the incarceration and also a survivor, and understanding that intersection, that when our communities get the basic needs met, when they have substance use treatment, when we have mental health treatment, that actually helps support survivors more than incarcerating our loved ones, which may have harmed us. And so coming from that intersectional place of both understanding the need for accountability, but also the need for services and having housing and some basic needs met, and understanding that that's the path forward to actually creating healthy communities is what brings me to the work.
Thank you. And I same, I'm really glad that folks are making that choice to share. I think it's something that I know can feel complicated for all of us, and how we build community and how these experiences get placed, sometimes leveraged. But I do appreciate that. And similarly, was the child of an incarcerated parent, and actually multiple generations of incarceration going back to the 60s, 70s, 80s. And then oftentimes when we are telling these stories, or when these stories get presented in these spaces, if we're here doing this successful work, there's sometimes this subtext or idea that all of these things are in people's pasts or have been left behind. And I know that many of us here, our families are still experiencing these things, and that most of the folks who've been impacted by the system aren't the so-called success stories and aren't necessarily doing okay. And it's because this system harms people over and over again. It doesn't just fail them, it actively harms them. And so similarly, all those generations of my family that have been impacted by incarceration and state violence, some of whom still are, and similar to that point that Yvette made, we all collectively are the stakeholders to have these conversations, because the experience of having been a so-called crime victim, or victim of violence, or victim of harm, the person who's experienced harm at the hands of people in their community, either people they know or don't know, and experienced harm at the hands of the state, be it the police, the DA's offices, the judges, the courtrooms, the jail cells, the prison cells, is usually the same person or the same family, and most often is in the same community. And so that conversation around, victim and offender, victim and perpetrator, those things, that's actually a false binary. It's a shared set of experiences. It's a collective set of experiences, and one that doesn't get, I think, appropriately contextualized. So it is a good opportunity for us to do that. And it's very much what drove forward this campaign. And in a way, this campaign became something unique, but hopefully sets a certain standard where it can become more of the norm, where people who've been impacted in all of these varieties of ways, because being impacted is obviously not a monolith, that people bringing these experiences forward had a chance to inform the analysis, lead the analysis, lead the strategy. Like Danielle said in the beginning about data, that the data may have been produced in an academic space, but it was coming from the point of view of the people experiencing these impacts. And the data exists to help articulate and put into text and put into tangible evidence simply what is already true, and not the other way around. And that the experience of the community and the communities and the generations that are coming into this work is something we all know to be true, and we don't need data to prove it. what data helps to do is gives us something to export, to share, and to build off of. So it's very important that we place data correctly, because oftentimes there's an overemphasis of data, a misunderstanding or an intentional misrepresenting of it. And then, like was said, again, what Danielle said earlier, that so often it's coming from the very systems and the very institutions that are causing the problem. And so we can't expect that data to not have a certain bias. And the idea of unbiased data, period, is kind of a myth. But it is a really important tool. And most important is the opportunity to have data framed by the points of views of the people who can help drive the system to change for the better and transform for the better. So there's a lot to talk about and a lot to share about how this work happened. And it's also, we're finding ourselves in a moment where everything that we've done and why we do it is once again being reaffirmed in this really distilled way because of this pandemic. All of the ways we know that these systems do not prioritize the wellness of our families, of our communities, all of the ways that we know there's a misuse of resources and a kind of effort to use what resources that are there to not actually protect people or provide to people is being felt now by everybody. We've seen now in a way that I don't know if we ever thought we would see in such a mass context, the way that our systems have been built. So now you have people who don't have food to eat, who are losing their businesses, who are losing their homes, who don't know if they're going to be safe. And meanwhile, the resources that exist are not going to solve those problems or get ahead of those problems. They are going right back into the very systems that cause those problems. And one of those systems, of course, is the system of state violence, of mass incarceration. We stop and think about how resources continue to get put in places to protect investments, to protect billionaires, to protect contractors, to protect developers, and to go into systems of imprisonment and caging and jailing and policing and surveillance and weapons that the system keeps reflexively doing that unless we're there to stop it and lead it in a different direction, which is what we've had a chance to successfully do here in Los Angeles against the backdrop of a kind of continuum of these systems that we all get to share. And it's why Kern County is so important to this conversation. What a lot of people who aren't in California don't understand about California is that while we are perhaps, and I would say we are, demographically, person by person, a very progressive place, institutionally, we are not. And no matter how much people tell you that this is a deep blue state with a Democratic supermajority and a Democratic governor, our institutions were not built by anyone progressive with any progressive goals. And that goes for LA County, and it goes for Kern County, and it goes for Riverside County and San Bernardino County, and just about every county in Southern California, and most of the counties in Northern California too. There's an idea, and I think it's a misunderstanding, that the coasts have something in common institutionally, that the Northeast and the West Coast are kind of the same, and then the middle of the country and the South has a different experience. While again, demographically, with the way people vote and things like that, there may be a lot of similarities on the coasts. Institutionally, California looks a lot more like the South and the Southwest than it does like the East Coast. The way that our political bodies were constructed was in the same interests that they were in those parts of the country, to guard and protect the interests of white supremacy, of settler colonialism, and to keep a minority rule in place if need be. And that's simply just a fact. And there's a very important and well-documented set of histories that we get to draw on to help us inform how we set this work forward. So LA County is getting a lot of attention now as kind of ground zero of mass incarceration. We lead the country in jailing. We have the largest law enforcement departments in the country. More people here die at the hands of law enforcement and jailing than any other place in the country. We hand out more death sentences than any place in the country. We give more dollars to these systems than any place in the country. And it frankly, it's not even close. It's not even close. The second place spots on these lists doesn't even come close to what LA is doing and what LA's been doing for generations and generations. Meanwhile, LA tries to portray itself to the rest of the country and the rest of the world as a progressive beacon when it's not. It's a place of a lot of state terror. It's a place of a lot of harm and a lot of death and a lot of corruption. And that's the backdrop that we're coming in. The legacies of people like Chief Parker and Sherman Block, on through Lee Baca and Daryl Gates, and on and on and on. The birthplace of 3 strikes, the birthplace of mandatory minimums, the birthplace of SWAT teams and militarized policing, the birthplace of databases and surveillance. It's all here. But because this is the population center, because alongside that, the whole time, the very same thing was happening in Kern County, and its impacts were being felt more harshly in Bakersfield than I would say anywhere else in the country, as far as per capita impact when it comes to state violence. So that's the approach that we took. We didn't pretend that we were in a world that we weren't in. We didn't show up to the county and say, let's have a conversation and make a deal and tweak around the edges and make things a little bit better here in LA County. We came in and said, you guys have a $3.5 billion jail expansion plan, which is going to end up costing taxpayers $7 billion, because that's how bond money works, to expand what is already the largest jail system in the world, the largest jailing county and the largest jailing state and the largest jailing country in the planet. And you guys want to expand that jail. So there's no exchange to happen. We're meeting you in a point of crisis where you need to fundamentally transform away from what you're doing and into a completely different direction. And of course, we're going to get met with the question, and we were met with the question. Well, before we were met with any questions, we were met with, what are you talking about? That's impossible. Save your breath. After we rejected the initial rejection, after we met their rejection with our own rejection, then it turned into, well, what do you intend to do? How would you do something like this? The die has already been cast. The ink has already been dried. The ground in some cases had already been broken. What do you intend to do? And we knew that we had to be accountable to our own demands and had to present an alternative vision. And not just around one jail plan, not just around one contract or one blueprint, around saying the largest jail in county needs to no longer be the largest jail in county. That a public health and care-centered approach will make all of us safer and will be less wasteful and will open up opportunities to grow into the kind of civic environment that we want to live in, that we want our kids to live in, and that should set the standard for the rest of the country. That we don't want LA to continue to lead in all the wrong things, but actually have an opportunity to lead in the right things. And so we put forth a comprehensive vision, a comprehensive report, 2 editions of that report, to kind of articulate to the county what they could do instead of what they were doing. And we didn't do it based on what we thought they would be okay with or what we thought might be realistic. We did it based on what should exist and gave them a chance to respond to that. This is the best case scenario. What would you do? You asked us what we would do. This is it. This is here. What's your response? It's like physics. If you put something into place, people have to respond to it rather than letting them mediate what you get to say or not say. But of course, that took a lot of work and there were a lot of moving parts. And it's such a long story and long history to even get us here. But we do get to talk about some of that. And that's what's really, really exciting. So I want to pass it back over to Yvette, who played such an important role in leading the formation of these demands, to talk a little bit about how we began that approach, which then circles back to some of what Danielle introduced in the beginning around how that met with some of the data analysis, which kicked off the first in a kind of succession of victories that bring us to today.
Yeah, thank you, Lex. I think something that you mentioned around the difference between institutions and the stakeholder voter landscape is super critical, because here in Los Angeles County, at the time when we launched the Justice LA Coalition and really started gearing up our pushback against the $3.5 billion jail expansion plan, we had a progressive board. 4 out of the 5 board members would identify as progressive, quote unquote. We have 1 lone Republican, and yet they had already approved 2 jail plans. So a women's jail that would have been out in Lancaster, and then a quote unquote mental health jail that would have been built in downtown LA. And we put forth arguments saying, A, the women's jail would be built on toxic soil. Women should actually be decarcerated, right? Specifically, the disproportionate numbers of Black women, which Danielle raised in the data. And then we said mental health needs cannot be met in a jail setting. And so when we were able to successfully push the Board of Supervisors to reject both plans because A, they were fiscally irresponsible, right? Like spending billions of dollars to expand an already ballooning jail system in LA County was fiscally irresponsible. It was not sustainable, and it was actually more harmful to our communities. And the board ultimately agreed with us after years of pushing, after years of presenting alternative plans, like Lex was alluding to. We had a decarceration plan that we had presented to the board that dealt with everything from pretrial reform to building out systems, decentralized systems of community-based services. And then we followed that up with our Care First budget the following year. The county ultimately moved to roll back this plan, which, like Lex mentioned, they had already approved. And this is super important. They had already done the environmental impact statement. They had already approved it. So they had already signed this and were paying the construction companies monthly. Millions of dollars were being paid out to already draft the plans for these new jails. And so even though outwardly it looked like we lost, we actually still had a window of opportunity to stop this. And I say this to you all that are in different counties where your boards may have already signed really harmful policies, that even when you lose, you can still win. There's always an opportunity to shift counties in a different direction. So when the county decided to end the mental health jail, they're like, okay, well, how about we build a mental health hospital instead? And it's still going to be run by the sheriffs, though, and it's going to be over 2,000 beds. And we're like, no, we're not buying it. You can call it a mental health hospital, but it's still going to be a jail if it's still a carceral setting, if it's still run by the sheriffs, and it's a massive institution that actually runs counter to what our communities need, which is local, community-based care that's accessible, that's culturally competent, that is built with trusted partners that are already doing the work in our community successfully, but are severely under resourced and underutilized by the county. And so that was our starting off point in terms of our pushback towards the county's impulse to just build massive centralized systems. We ultimately won that fight as well, and the county completely shut down that jail expansion plan. And in the same breath, they started what is called the Alternatives to Incarceration Work Group. And this work group was unprecedented in the fact that they had county department representatives as voting members of this work group, but they also had community representatives that were voting members of this work group. So we had folks like Dr. Kelly Lytle Hernandez, like one of our colleagues, Eunice Hernandez, like Dolores Canales from the Bail Project. Folks that are part of our coalition were appointed to be voting members to decide what ultimately would be encompassed in the report that this work group was directed to deliver. It was called the Care First, Jails Last, Alternatives to Incarceration report. And if you haven't read that report, I highly urge you to read it. And it was drafted by hundreds of community members. Thousands of community members weighed in open public community forums. And many of us were actually leading the drafting of the recommendations in this report in countless meetings, so many hours of meeting across from the representatives from the Sheriff's Department, from the DA's office, from the Public Defender's office, from the health departments. We had to collaborate with the county to build out these recommendations. However, although we had to collaborate with these entities, we out-organized them. So we flooded all of their meeting space with our folks, with community members, with our organizers and our organizations to help inform what these recommendations would look like. We outpaced them and we outmaneuvered them. And so ultimately, after this year-long process of building these recommendations, the final product reflects more of what the community demands are than what the institutional priorities were, which is what makes this document so, I would say, revolutionary, that it's the voices of communities that were central to the drafting of this report. And ultimately, the county adopted what we're calling the 26 foundational recommendations. So the top recommendations of over 100 recommendations that are included in the report, those are the first recommendations that the county is now in the process of implementing. They have hired a director of the ATI initiative, who has been spearheading that work over the last few months. And now we're in the implementation phase, which of course is the most important phase, right? So much of our work, we're fighting hard to get these recommendations, but then the reports sit on a shelf and collect dust. But we are continuously making sure that all of the recommendations in the report are fully implemented and actually continue to reflect the demands of our community, especially in this moment of COVID-19, where a lot of our communities are suffering as a result of the same institutional failures that led to the expansion of jails here in Los Angeles to the magnitude that they're at. And I'll stop there. Lex, do you want to add anything else?
Sure. I mean, condensing what has been a 2-year kind of experience into a short conversation is always challenging. But at the same time, to bring about such huge changes in a time as short as a couple years is actually quite revolutionary as well. And the ATI process itself took at least a year. And it's important to just talk about how we approached that and the huge effort that led us to stopping the jail plan. And I should be clear that it was stopped because there was no desire to compromise. We offered a hand. We said, we will hold your hand and walk you towards the goal. We will work with you in a collaborative spirit to get to what we believe our communities deserve. And we will do the work, even if it means sometimes doing your own job for you. We will do that. And that meant talking to everybody. That meant engaging every department that we felt was relevant in the county, going to diversion programs that were tiny, that were pilot programs, that weren't even necessarily set up to succeed or to sustain. And as many of you know, in bureaucracies, there will be sometimes really good pilot programs, really good public health programs, diversion programs. And when it comes time for austerity, when it comes time for budget cuts, those are always the ones that are the first to go. Programs that are there for youth development, leadership development, alternatives to incarceration, diversion, public health, and on and on and on. Those get cut, but they get cut because they're set up to not be sustainable. So we approached many of those programs and said, what would your blue sky scenario look like? What would it be like if instead of jailing almost 20,000 people a day, we diluted that and redirected resources and you had a chance to take on the challenge? What would you need? And they gave us those answers and they said, this is what a perfect world would look like for our department. We could scale up 500%, a thing that would sound, in their mind, may have sounded ridiculous to the point that they would never even approach the county and say, this is what we'd like to do. But they said, if you want to say it, you can say it. We can't necessarily advocate for ourselves, but if you want to say it, we would certainly, if somehow that happened, we would be delighted. And what we found was that in advocating for exactly what was right, again, not just what they told us was possible, but what was right, what we found was those folks that initially told us, well, we can't fight for our own, but if you do it, we'll gladly take the resources, is that they did end up fighting. They did end up showing up and advocating for what was best. In some cases, they took on law enforcement in front of everybody and had the confrontations and said, no, what you do doesn't work and what we do can work. And eventually, the County Board of Supervisors, and I should be honest, this was a goal of ours. We knew that what we were asking for was the right thing, but we knew that it wouldn't go as well if they were only hearing that from us, because then it would turn into kind of a tit for tat, or like this is an agenda of theirs, this is an activist agenda, this is a group of kind of a concentration of advocates who want something. We didn't want to feel like us against them. We wanted them to be overwhelmed by the demand for what was right. And the more angles that they were hearing it from, the more voices they were hearing it from. If there was a cacophony of voices demanding that this is what it should be, where were they going to run and hide to? What were they going to do? How were they going to dance around it? And so when those departments that were in the very county that we're talking to said, yes, if we had these resources, we could do this, and here's what the impacts would be, and they would be exponentially better for everybody with regards to public safety, with regards to public health, then that would kind of force change into place no matter what anybody wanted. And that's exactly what happened. And we even at one point had one of the county board offices tell us, we sat down with them one day, it was one of the board offices, actually the Republican board office, one of their deputies said to us, you've made this job, but this past year, you've made me like this job more than I've ever liked it. because you were talking to everybody, because you were talking to all of the departments. Now we have to talk to all of the departments. And all of a sudden this bureaucracy is functioning, and all of a sudden government is functioning better. And it was a really interesting thing for us to hear this from somebody who normally, you know, might be theoretically our opposition, to share that gratitude, because all of a sudden that political inertia, that kind of unspoken set of bureaucratic impulses where everything gets pushed behind closed doors and deals start to get cut and it gets very corrupt and it rots from the inside, that was all cracked open. And now everybody was sharing with each other their own ideas and what they wanted and what they thought would be best. And all of a sudden there seemed to be more pride to be a part of this county than there ever had been before. And to see that kind of empowerment spread, and to see all this multitude of actors feel a kind of proprietary energy to what Justice LA's demands were, was exactly what we wanted, because this kind of vision should belong to everybody. This is what everybody should want. And so that created a huge push and momentum, and it created such a climate of pressure that eventually they caved and did a thing that, like Yvette said, everybody said was impossible. Everybody said you can't turn back on something that's already been set that far in motion, where millions of dollars are being spent for construction contracts. How do you stop something like that? But it really was people power that stopped it. And then they created the Alternatives to Incarceration work group, where what they then had to do was create this very transparently democratic process that everybody had to participate in. But that also wasn't necessarily set up to be successful. I think that they thought that we might wilt under the malaise and the minutia of having to sit at the table with all of the county actors and detail, point by point, come up with a whole new plan of governance that included input from people like the sheriffs and the DAs and the judges, not just us and not just our public health allies. We made a commitment that we would occupy every working corner of that Alternatives to Incarceration work group process and organize it and say, okay, we now all have a chance to see this through and implement this vision. And that's exactly what happened. And it was a tremendous amount of work, but it was very, very engaged and very refreshing and very, gratifying to watch so many different people weigh in this space together and call for things that really matter, that they're not used to doing in these spaces, including things that might not be seen as politically convenient, like demanding safe consumption spaces for drug users and demanding, shelter spaces that don't just look like traditional housing, and demanding divestment from law enforcement, demanding what they call the intercept model that disrupts opportunities for law enforcement and police to be the first responders, and instead give people a chance to, when in crisis, have the first person they deal with be a public health professional or a social work professional or a community-based service provider. These are things that I think in the past people have wanted to marginalize those kinds of demands, but those demands were put very much front and center on the table. And by the time it was all said and done, when we had the final version of the ATI process finished, this document that we've shared in the chat, the other day I was on a separate panel with Eunice Hernandez, who we've mentioned, and I said, when it was all said and done, I'd say we got about like 90% of what we wanted. And I said, correct me if I'm wrong, Eunice. And she was like, no, I'd say we got more than 90% of what we wanted. And that's true. We got what we wanted in that. And now where we're at now is, how do we implement this for real and make it tangible? And we were well on our way to that when the pandemic struck. But to be so armed with something when they want to circle right back to the 40 years of austerity style politics that they've done to gut our communities for so long, they don't get to do that now. So they're not achieving what they hoped to do, which was to undercut this whole thing all over again and take us back to square one. They can't. All it did was slow down the process. But the process of getting towards what ATI is supposed to be is still in motion and still happening. And it interweaves with a bunch of other legislative and policy wins that we've achieved to kind of compound the vision. So I'll stop there and pass it back over to the others. I'm not sure exactly where we're at, so I don't know if you want to add more, Yvette, and I know that Danielle and Michelle are also going to talk about some of like the kind of practitioner work that happened around data in the work groups, but I'll pass it to Yvette first.
I'll just leave folks with a few things. So even though we supported the writing of this really transformative document, the ATI report, which is in the chat box, the county, once COVID hit, really slowed down the implementation process. And also they had an opportunity in that budget cycle to start investing the money that's needed to fully implement the report, and they didn't. And so seeing that the county was still dragging its feet on actually putting money behind this narrative that they're pushing of care first, jails last, we decided that we needed to put a ballot measure on the November ballot to force the county's hand to move money out of law enforcement and into community-based services, into the ATI initiative, into youth development. And that's why we supported and launched the Measure J campaign and successfully won Measure J to be able to secure that funding. And so even now, we're still pushing the county to make the investments necessary to be able to realize this vision. And so, this past year, the narrative around divesting from law enforcement and investing in community care has really taken front and center. But this has been a community demand for generations, right? And this is not a demand that's just sprung up. It's something that we've been working diligently towards for a very long time, and it's the only way that we're able to actually realize real change in our communities. And just for some context, many of our county and city budgets, it's 40, 50, 60% or upwards of that of our budgets go to law enforcement, go to jails, go to probation, go to sheriff's departments and police departments, go to punitive systems. And so when we think about just being able to fund other departments, they're all fighting each other for a very small piece of the pie. Meanwhile, law enforcement budgets don't get hit, while our communities have been divested from, our communities have been defunded, right? So our demands to invest in our communities are demands that will actually make us safer, right? And really push back against these fear tactics that if we shift funding out of punitive systems, our communities are going to be less safe. In fact, the data actually shows the opposite. When we actually invest in health and human services, in housing, our communities are safer. So just wanted to leave you all with that as you're thinking about how do you frame the narratives in your communities to support alternatives to incarceration. It's really about reimagining and redefining what public safety means. And I think I'll hand it over. I think Michelle, you might be next.
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. Michelle Paris. I use she, her pronouns. I'm program director at Vera, California. For those of you who don't know about the Vera Institute of Justice, we are a national nonprofit focused on ending mass criminalization and incarceration. Our headquarters is in New York, but we also have satellite offices, including Los Angeles County, where I work. Typically, we work with government to create change from within and promote accountability and transparency. Many people know us as a research organization. We study problems, drive policy, and legislative solutions. We were part of the LA County Alternatives to Incarceration effort, working with many of the people here on this call. And we continue to work for implementation of the recommendations, as Yvette mentioned. I think Yvette, Lex, and Danielle really covered so much of what the effort was. And in particular, Danielle and Million Dollar Hoods, their work helped to transform the political landscape to the point where the board was committed to this Care First vision and started this work. We came in once the work group had already been formed. So there's one component of using data to transform the political landscape to build power for change. And then there's another use, which is also helping to sort of drive momentum and drive implementation. And that's a little bit of where we came in. So some of what we did, we worked with Million Dollar Hoods closely in the ATI effort. And Danielle, obviously feel free to chime in as I'm presenting or after. But we often bring into these more local spaces a national perspective because we work in a lot of different jurisdictions. We do research in a lot of different places. So really, we saw our role as weaving together local and national data analyses with the lived experiences of people in LA County. So sometimes research organizations can do analysis and present information without understanding the local landscape, and while meaning well, while trying to end mass incarceration, research and data can sometimes actually harm efforts that are happening on the ground. So it was really important for us to understand the local landscape, to work with people who were on the ground and who understood the local system, and provide a national lens. In addition, we were able to bring in data and research that supported, as Lex and others have said, people with lived experiences have been recommending things that are the best practice, for years. And so part of what we did was be able to bring some of the evidence into the space to say, yes, people have considered this, people have studied it. And just like generations have been asking, this is actually the best practice to start decreasing the historic reliance on incarceration. So in that way, we're bolstering what people have often been asking for years and for generations. So some of what we were doing was, once the elected officials had really bought into the Care First vision, it can be helpful to bring in the sort of evidence from other jurisdictions to show them that people outside have contemplated these same things, tried them and come to the same conclusion. It can also make elected officials feel like there's solid grounding to implement the recommendations that have been made. And then it can help shape some of the recommendations such that jurisdictions can avoid some of the common pitfalls that actually happen once you're trying to implement these kind of recommendations. So we were able to bring in national data, but also some of the best practices that we know from research and work around the country. And I guess I can leave it there. I just want to speak briefly about what our role was. And as I noted, we continue to use data analysis and research to help push the county to actually implement these recommendations. Danielle, since we worked closely together during the ATI process, anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would just uplift that Vera came in and, in no small part really helped move things along, like Michelle was saying, increased momentum. It was another thought partner, a data thought partner in some of this work, which I think was a tremendous asset. I wanted to speak a little bit to folks who may be on this call from other areas outside of LA, like Kern County, but maybe other counties too. I think I saw Orange County on here too. There may be other places who are trying to or thinking through how they might replicate similar successes in their own jurisdictions. And I think it may seem, I just want to speak to like how it may seem daunting because, all the things that we've explained can be so complex and are very organic in some ways, right? That it's not really just a cut and paste type of thing, right? But I want to assure you like that community first organizing is a direction for success that I think Yvette and Lex spoke to in amazing ways. And for those of you who are like, yes, we've got our community organizers together, we may not have like the university data partners, or we may not have like the research organizations like Vera, who we can look to help, complement the work that we're doing. I think that is may be challenging in your area, but is something that universities would welcome in a lot of instances, especially particular faculty at different universities or maybe different research organizations as well. That it's really about finding these allyships and thinking outside of your typical organizing networks to uplift the maybe non-traditional resources that have been used in organizing. Maybe, in the past, I don't know a lot of other data offices that help and serve community in this way. Yvette, Lex, Michelle, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't heard of a lot of us. But I do want to assure you that it doesn't make it impossible. And I would like to offer even myself, to, if you're interested in thinking through about how to make those connections with universities as a resource to folks.
Thanks, Danielle. And I, similarly, I think if folks are thinking about different policy recommendations, you can always email me or folks at Vera to say, you know, have people tried safe consumption sites? What does the research say? Have people tried, you know, X efforts, or do we have data that supports X policy recommendations? And we can provide that kind of national expertise and, you know, help provide resources in case you need that kind of support.
One thing that I'll add that I really appreciate from Vera and Million Dollar Hoods is that the data is accessible to our communities. There is use of like visual representation. There's short one-sheeters. So often in research, we're sifting through 200 pages of a dissertation, and that's just not accessible to our community members. And so being able to synthesize reports, synthesize data that is both accessible to our community members so that they feel empowered, and also accessible to the county, who is also not very inclined to read through a 200-page document. They want a quick, just one-sheeter. That has made a huge difference in being able to translate what we're seeing on the ground to reports that are there, then accessible to our communities, that they can utilize it as efficient advocacy tools when we're doing campaigns and pushing for change at the county level.
Thank you all. Unless our panelists have anything else they want to touch on, this is the part of our agenda where we can open it up to questions from you all. If you have any questions for any of our panelists, you can put them in the Q&A box or in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you to ask your question. So we'll wait a minute here to see if you all have questions for us. And my colleague Rosa is monitoring the questions. Any questions on your end, Rosa, to bring to the panelists?
Nothing new has come up. There were some requests to sharing data information. So I think it'd be great if some of the panelists can present on where people can access some of the data they reference, or other places where a community can access this information.
I know that the Million Dollar Hoods reports are all on the Million Dollar Hoods website. I don't know if that's been dropped in the chat yet.
Yeah, I think we should link to that. And Danielle, I think you're probably in the best position to answer. When we were working with the ATI work group, we really relied on Million Dollar Hoods to do the local data analysis. We brought the sort of national perspective, but maybe Danielle, you can talk about communities accessing their own data.
Yeah, so sorry, I just was checking out the chat, but I'll answer that question first. Yes, I'm gonna put a more direct link to all of our reports and our map room in the chat in just a moment. But in terms of access, we are actually working on doing a complete transparency launch for Million Dollar Hoods, where right now data is accessible like in aggregate, right? So you can see the reports that were driven by community, but we're working towards making the actual data available for download and dashboards, so folks can tinker with and see how the data intersects to draw their own analysis. It's a large undertaking, but up until this point, it's primarily been community partners contact us. They say, listen, we need to understand this data a little bit more in these different ways. And we produce a report or a memo or a white paper or something like that, or update our maps. But we're moving forward. We are really trying to even increase the accessibility and transparency of the data, because the number of questions have gone up, and we want people to be able to answer those in like real time without having to wait on our team to say, okay, like, we're going to run this next week. So I'm really trying to always improve and serve in that way and respond. I hope that answers the question.
There's a question from the Facebook page. People just curious about more local Kern County information. Are similar data available for Kern County folks? And if not, how can we or they support this and bring it to Kern?
Yeah, actually, Million Dollar Hoods put out 2 rapid response reports on Kern County. Well, one on Bakersfield and one on Kern County on cases dismissed. And I'm gonna get this link up and drop it in the chat. But I think we're also working with, as part of the transparency project, that data will be made available. But we also have plans to just link people with how we got access to the data, right? And share the data eventually, because we need to make sure it's not shared in the form that it's given to us, because as you all might imagine, when you get data from law enforcement, it is really, it's what we call dirty data. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. Things need to be cleaned up. If you tried to analyze it directly, you'd have a lot of issues and may come up with incorrect analyses. So we have to do some back end work to make sure that what we present to the public and put out there is digestible and understandable. But I hope that answers the question about Kern County. Million Dollar Hoods also has some data on Orange County, and we're working with Orange County partners currently on some of that analysis as well. But I think we're also scheduling a future webinar to talk through in more detail the Kern County data in particular. And maybe I'll pass it back to the Kern County folks to talk about that a bit more.
Just one quick thing to add, if I can, just before we go back to the Kern County folks, is that there is also some state data that's available that you can find out about Kern County. So the BSCC website, I think it stands for Board of State and Community Corrections. They do provide some regular updates on the jail populations in all of the counties across California. So there may also be uses for some of this kind of broader data. And I can tell you, we looked at it recently. And for Kern County from January to I think September, which is the most recent data of 2020, the Kern County jail population decreased by 2% and the pretrial population actually increased by 3%. So we've seen some other counties where the decreases are much more significant, but you can also track some of these changes and use some of that information in the advocacy if you want to kind of take a broader look. And a lot of what Danielle is describing is individual level data where you can really ask a lot of different questions of what's happening. And here you can get some of the bigger picture questions answered as well. And I'll pass it back to the Kern folks.
There's a couple of questions about how to get engaged in this work in Kern County. And I think Joseph and a couple of other had asked that in the chat. So in the end, we are some of the local partners are gonna share about how to support this work in Kern County. So stay tuned. There is a couple of questions in the chat, in the Q&A section, if panelists just wanna take that on. But I also do want to acknowledge one question in the chat, and I think it's a really good question, is that can you share how community can feel safe as they move this work forward in their respective community, especially in the more conservative of communities? I guess fear of retaliation or being blacklisted or something like that. So if panelists can answer that question.
I think that's a really important question. And there's no simple answer for it. It has definitely been something that we've experienced. And again, what I do want to dispel is the idea, at least in California, this idea of like more conservative versus less conservative, because there are truths there around elected officials and things like that. But we're dealing with across the state institutions that are very violent and have been able to kind of coast by without accountability and with the continued growth of access to resources and political power for a really long time. And we're beginning to change that. And that's really exciting and really good. But of course, none of us want to pretend like that doesn't come with some risk. And we have had retaliation happen to our communities, to ourselves for many, many years now. And there's a whole conversation that we could have about security and how can people stay secure and make sure their communication is secure, and that they, do not put themselves unnecessarily in harm's way. And part of that, though, is making sure that we are all talking about it openly and as loudly as possible. That the more that happens in plain sight, the better. That we connect with our legal allies, legal advocates, lawyers who are ready to quickly respond. That we build relationships with the county, with people in departments that are supportive of what we're doing. That we build relationships with the board and their offices, so that they have to hear from us when things like this happen. And retaliation happens in the streets, and it also happens inside the jails, and people get hurt. And sometimes it's really, really bad. And sometimes people aren't safe. And sometimes there's retaliation from people with different ideologies and so on and so forth. So it's good that that's brought up. And it's good that it's acknowledged, because it really does happen. And it happens more than people realize. We're involved in a class action right now with the Sheriff's Department to get people out of jail during COVID. And just off that, there's been retaliation to some of our plaintiffs inside. One of our staff members who helps represent those plaintiffs had guns pulled on him by the sheriffs just a few months ago in front of his house in retaliation for it. We've had people over the years have their homes raided, be surveilled, and someone mentioned something about being blacklisted and things like that. There's always that fear. And as far as people trying to damage your career and blacklisting and make it harder for you politically, or try to block funding from your organization, that happens too. And it's not just from the state. Sometimes even other organizations who feel like your vision is too transformative or too radical or disrupting a deal they might have struck. They might benefit their pockets, but doesn't benefit the community. And you call that out, there can be those forms of retaliation too. We recently had a big victory stopping a really harmful pretrial bill, Prop 25. Unfortunately, we won that struggle. But in the process, even our own peer organizations worked very hard to get us blocked from funding sources and discredited and things like that. And these are supposed to be our, I wouldn't say go as far as to say comrades, but our peers. And we had to kind of experience that. And fortunately, we came out on the winning end and we're in good shape. But that was a really, informative experience, not in a good way. So building these networks, like, we're not here trying to do just a one-off webinar. We are wanting to build a relationship from community to community, from county to county, that none of this work succeeds without each other. The wins we had here on the ground in LA didn't happen without work that we were doing even in other parts of the country. Jail closure work we were supporting in places like Philadelphia, in places like Northern California, in places like Georgia. Those relationships and those wins were all leveraged to help the other achieve even greater wins, but also to keep each other safe, to be talking in our networks, talking in our broad channels, talking to media. Whenever something like that happens, for example, there's people I talk to with some regularity at the LA Times. Whenever something like that happens, I let the reporters know. Whether you want to write about it or not, whether you have capacity, I want you to know that this is happening, that this issue that you cover means that these kinds of threats are happening, these kinds of compromises of people's safety is happening. And what inevitably ends up happening, and this happened recently with some of what I'm sure you're all hearing about with the California, with Javier Mercedes, the California AG launching an investigation at LA County Sheriff's Department, was, recently a reporter who was covering a recent shooting involving the sheriffs was assaulted by sheriffs outside of the hospital, and that made the news. And the reporters end up experiencing the same things that we're experiencing. And it builds a collective desire for accountability, because we know that the things that we're saying are true. So as much open platform dialogue as possible, as much of a willingness to share everything that's happening as possible. So they have to know that people are watching, talking to people inside the county. We had a community member whose cousin was murdered by the sheriffs, and then they were holding vigil in their community in East LA, and the sheriffs kept coming and terrorizing them. We made sure that we communicated that to that district office, and they started sending somebody down to where they were holding vigil to have to bear witness and be watching. Those are the things that we do our best to do, and also consistently talking to, like I said, people inside the county, be it at the public defender's office, be it the county board offices themselves, and then talking to, like I said, lawyers who are used to representing folks in moment of crisis, and making sure we have rapid response networks in place if something happens, that people can come be supported. But all this to say, I definitely want to acknowledge it can feel really scary sometimes, and we don't always feel safe. We had the sheriff recently make kind of what felt like calls to action against us, accusing us of trying to do something really bad, accusing us of taking money that we weren't. He said all these things that were really blatant lies that put us in danger. And unfortunately for him, he also said it about certain people inside the county, like the county CEO's office, who ended up suing him for making those claims. And so he paid for it. But he was making those claims about us, including saying that we wanted to turn the streets into Mad Max and cause people to be unsafe, and that we had a hidden agenda, and, you know, trying to put targets on people's backs. So it's a very long answer because there really is no one tidy answer, but I appreciate you asking it. And it's a thing, unfortunately, is on our minds all the time. And sometimes I don't think we talk about it enough because it's upsetting to have to talk about.
Now, one thing I'll add, you know, the narratives that come out of law enforcement when we're seeking reform is that what Lex just mentioned, that it's going to be mayhem and anarchy and Mad Max and all of that. And it makes people feel unsafe. But I think it's important to recenter the conversation around, are folks feeling safe now? And by and large, the answer is no. Either it's a lack of safety because of housing destabilization, or lack of food, lack of health care. There's all of these other elements that make people feel unsafe in their lives. And this, you know, hypothetical threat by our community members is actually not as tangible as the threat of losing your home right now. And I think it's important to recenter that conversation, and then also point out, here in Los Angeles, the sheriff's department hasn't laid off any law enforcement agents. We have just as many sheriffs, just as many cops as we did, you know, before the pandemic. And alternatives to incarceration has yet to be fully implemented here in Los Angeles. And yet law enforcement keeps pushing these narratives that, you know, violence is increasing because we're soft on crime here, when in fact we still haven't realized these all of the recommendations that we keep putting forth. And so the status quo isn't working for our communities. So it's important to hear from your folks in your localities around what they're experiencing right now, and really get them involved in those conversations, because so often the law enforcement narratives are the ones that are getting the most attention from media, are the ones that, you know, our local electeds are listening to the most. But the reality of the situation is that lack of investment is what's destabilizing our communities and making them feel unsafe.
Thank you for answering those questions. There's a couple of more that I'm going to read, and anyone can take a stab. The first one is, how did your group write policies, the legal writing to present to legislation? Wondering if smaller groups that lack, say, political legal education, I mean, basically, how can activists or organizers tackle the writing if they don't know it formally?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think this is a good opportunity to raise some of the resources that are available for folks that may not have a policy background and might not know how to write a policy brief. The Women's Policy Institute is a really great resource. They have a fellowship program, both a local and a state program. So if you want to learn how to write local policy, you can apply for their local program. If you want to learn how to write, you know, state bills, you can apply for their state program, and it's open to anyone that identifies as a woman, like a cis woman, a trans person, gender nonconforming person, intersex person. And I went through that program and I highly recommend it. It's also important to look into partnerships with organizations that may have those resources and that could do that type of public education around what drafting a policy brief can look like. And sometimes it's as simple as, you know, writing a memo, like I want to demystify what advocacy tools look like. You can write a bullet pointed one sheet with your demands and take that to a meeting. You don't need to necessarily know how to write a motion for your board of supervisors. They have staff that can do that for you. But it's important to build those relationships with those folks in office and be able to communicate in very like simple, accessible terms what your demands are, and then lean on them to utilize the resources of the department in order to do that. But of course, partnering with organizations, academic institutions that can provide those skills, those resources is another really good option. But do want to uplift the Women's Policy Institute. It's been a huge resource for me, and I know a lot of other impacted people that may not have found policy accessible.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. A couple of more questions that I think it will be worth just sharing live is, do you have any tips with a more conservative base in moving the ideas of law and order to decarceration?
Yeah, I mean, I think I named this earlier, but the arguments around fiscal responsibility, right? Those seem to be, conservative talking points that they love to lean into. But when it comes to funding policing and funding incarceration, this conservative value of like fiscal responsibility kind of goes out the window. So I think, it depends on your community what talking points will land. But I've seen across the board, utilizing their same frameworks against them, because at the end of the day, it costs so much more to incarcerate a person with mental health needs than it is to provide them services in their community, and the results and the data support that argument. Not only is it cheaper for the county or for your local municipality to invest in care in the community rather than incarceration, it's also more effective in providing and delivering the services, and it actually lowers recidivism and it supports public safety. So again, this whole public safety narrative has been around, cops equals public safety, when in fact, services and community-based resources equals public safety. So own the public safety argument, own the fiscal responsibility argument when having conversations with folks that lean conservative in your areas.
Yeah, I would add, and Yvette mentioned this earlier, but it's a really driving kind of fundamental idea we hold, which is that a win is not always a win and a loss is not always a loss, is that it's okay for a few times to have them say, no, that's not going to happen, because we're putting the truth on the table. I think sometimes there's pressure to almost translate our demands into a different language for conservatives or for who we imagine our opposition to be, rather than simply saying this is true and you can't prove it wrong, and we're going to keep saying it, and more of us are going to keep saying it, and we're going to keep saying it to your face and in digital platforms and in earned media and in reports, and we're going to go to departments who we know would benefit from this vision and get them to start saying it, finding the departments in the county at Kern, for example, who might provide the kind of services that would benefit from decarceration. And it's not always the head of the department. Sometimes in fact, rarely is it, to be honest. It's that number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. You find the person in the department who's willing to ride for something, and they exist. And it takes time sometimes to find them, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you click right away and you find that person who's willing to go into those spaces and try to carry those demands and start those conversations. And having them along with everybody else, along with your community base, along with the people you're building relationships with every day, saying what they want, not what they think will fly, but what they actually want. Knowing that for a while, people are going to tell you that you're completely out of line, that you're off base. People will try to marginalize you. They'll try to make you feel like you're unrealistic, like your head is in the clouds, like you're silly. And we know that what we're asking for is not any of those things. And the only reason we're being met with that is because they also know it's true, and it's scary. A real vision that's going to change things is scary for a lot of people, not just the people who are in charge. And so that's all I'll say too, is that sometimes that first couple go-rounds might not be seen as a traditional win, but you're shifting the ground under people's feet. And you never know when it's going to fully take hold. Sometimes it takes a decade. Usually it doesn't. Usually it takes a much shorter time. And before you know it, everybody's waking up into a different reality where now the way that conversation is framed is different, whether you're in a so-called conservative district or not. Because again, even in Los Angeles, sometimes the so-called liberal district that's doing conservative policies is even harder to change, because they get to hide behind the fact that they're seen as liberal or Democrats or progressives and still continue to give massive amounts of money to police and allow for really draconian punitive policies to take hold. And the judges that we have in LA County are, some of them are judges from the Reagan era. I mean, we have an incredibly conservative bench here in Los Angeles County, and that's the same across the state, or most parts of the state. So we can't assume anything based on, you know, what the top line liberal conservative idea of a place is. And so that can sometimes be a reminder that what we want to do instead is simply demand what's right. Because if we're going to the county of LA like we did 2 years ago and said, you don't get to ask us, well, what about the violent charges, until you've cut the jail population in half. And half, in our case at the time, was almost 9,000 people, which is more than most people's whole jail population. That is going to be met with ridicule initially, but they knew that we were right. And so starting all the way at the goal rather than starting from a compromised place, in our opinion, is kind of like the least you can do. And it gets you somewhere. Every time you're told no, you're actually gaining a lot of ground. And like I said, the metaphor that always works for me, and I said this already, is shifting the ground under people's feet. And we've done it on a number of policy issues, both locally and nationally. And it's really, really worked. And part of it is because we've consistently said the same thing. And the only time we've altered our message is if we've learned something, or there's been growth, or we've needed to evolve what we're saying because of that traction, because of those gains.
Yeah, and to the question around like how do you get your foot in the door, just some, basic steps, like go to your Board of Supervisors website and look at each office and see who their staff is. Like, who are the justice deputies? Who are the health deputies? And you want to make contact with the deputies, like schedule a meeting, because they're often the ones briefing the supervisors. They're the ones that are writing the motions that they're going to be voting on. Like, you really want to build relationships with those justice deputies specifically, but also the health deputies, also the housing deputies. If you build those relationships, they'll funnel you information. Like, you'll get a better sense of what the internal politics of your county are when you make those relationships. And like Lex said, don't necessarily feel like if you don't get a meeting with the head of, the Department of Mental Health, that you're not getting your foot in the door. Like, try to connect with other staff within the departments, because they're the ones that are probably going to be the most honest. Because usually the heads of the department are more influenced by, politics. They don't want to burn bridges with the supervisors or the CEO's office, but the staff under them may be a little bit more willing to share information. And also make contact with your CEO's office. They're usually the ones that set the budget, right? Like, the Board of Supervisors ultimately votes on the budget, but the CEO's office recommends what the board should be adopting as their budget. And so the more contact you make with different county departments, the more of a chance you have to build internal allies within the counties, which was really important for us, for the supervisors to hear our message coming from folks within other departments, like Lex had mentioned. And I would also add, last thing, that if LA County is indicative of how bureaucracies work, most of the time the county departments are not talking to each other. We found that, mental health was not talking to health services. Health services has beef with, the Department of Health. There's just so much like internal conflict and lack of communication that we kind of positioned ourselves as the go-between between county departments, actually making introductions to different staff within the county to the Board of Supervisors. So really injecting yourself in those conversations it will be really helpful, and make yourselves indispensable to the counties, because even within the board offices, they often don't communicate things. And so a board office will ask us, so did you speak to so-and-so's board office? What did they say? What do you think? And so being kind of a go-between makes you indispensable, and it builds trust with the board offices, because when you're able to when they know that you're in conversation with other offices, they're more likely to work with you. They can be competitive between each other.
That's such a good point. And we also use platforms at our disposal, like social media really is helpful because people pay attention. And so we had a consistent stream of social media kind of presence, naming the supervisors all the time. If they did something we liked, we lauded them for it and we gave them a high five, virtual high five. If they did something that we did not like, we also named that too and put pressure on them. And we realized that they started to kind of pay attention to that, feel a little bit shook by that. These particular politicians across the county, people in these offices, supervisors' offices, they're not used to scrutiny. These aren't highly public offices. Most people aren't really thinking about them as much as they probably should. So elevating their profile worked really well. And like Yvette said, getting everybody talking to each other, pretty soon they started coming to us for information. And what we found is that when you start to build a groundswell and have people make pointed asks, is that there's always somebody from that office who does want to talk to you, even if it's just their own curiosity. They want to hear what the community's doing. They want to be able to report to their people that they know what's happening on the ground. There's a lot of kind of unspoken incentives that everybody has of wanting to be informed and wanting to be able to orient the people that are around them. And you're giving them that information. We represent the community. Here's how people are feeling. Here's the impacts that are happening. Most people in these counties know that their jail systems and that their law enforcement systems are corrupt and harmful. And so sometimes they really welcome the opportunity to just hear from people that are impacted and have to think about it and bring those conversations back. And even, and this is more tricky and delicate, you do find that, or I should say, we found that there were people even in those departments, there were people even in the sheriff's department and DA's offices who wanted to talk to us, who actually believed in what we were doing. Doesn't mean they were going to turn around and fight for it, but they wanted to have a relationship. When we're bringing forth a vision that makes a lot of sense, you know, sensible people are going to connect with it. Even if they're sensible people working in departments that we don't even think should exist, you can't deny that some connection forms out of that. The same departments that might be pulling guns on us, they're huge departments. There's other people in there who want to sit and have a coffee with you and really learn. It's very complicated, and it's why we also need each other, because that's a lot to process all the time. And to have to go back and then just talk to each other, like, you know, I talked with this person and then I talked with that person. We made a point to never go into these meetings alone if we could help it, unless it was like a real relationship that had been developed where you can now talk to that person. And so you kind of always have each other's backs. But those are just really good points I feel like Yvette was making. I wanted to expand on them. And the social media thing can feel cliche, but when you develop a really consistent and loud presence, it really is effective, because we all care about what's being said about us online. Obviously we do. And they're no different. And they started to realize that we were fair. So the last thing I'll say about this is it's so important to have a really disciplined message. You know how they say you don't tweet or don't post online or Facebook or whatever platform you're accessing when you're in a bad mood or you're in your feelings? It's the same thing. We made sure to not be irresponsible with our messaging, where we consistently, to this day, make sure that even when we're criticizing you, we're doing so in a way that centers exactly on what you're doing. We didn't give in to the temptation to have like the theatrics. When we went to the Board of Supervisors in person, we had a lot of comrades who were steeped in more of like an activist tradition, who wanted to boo and hiss and make things like, you know, shut shit down and do all of that. And we said, that's a tool in a toolbox. That's not the only thing we're going to do. There may be a day we do have to shut things down. There may be a day, if they start breaking more ground, where folks do have to chain themselves to the bulldozers. That's a thing that sometimes people have to do. But we're not going to do the thing that they expect us to do, which will allow them to slam the door in our face. And we're not going to do the other thing that they expect us to do, which is to do everything we can to get inside the room. Like I said, we never compromised once, but we also never gave them an excuse to tune us out. We were very clear over and over again. And I say this because they began checking our social media, and they said that to us themselves. We've all become really sensitive to your social media, and we're all paying attention to it, because they knew that everything we were saying was fair. And they knew that every piece of analysis we were putting out was being put out in good faith, and that we vetted everything that we said. And so you become almost an authority in that space when you choose to have that kind of discipline in your messaging. And all this to say too, that we're here to continue to build with folks here in Kern County. So this is not just like a didactic presentation where we're trying to give game and then leave. Like, we're here on the follow-up. We're meeting weekly about how we can continue to support the work on the ground in Kern County, and that no one should ever have to do this work alone, and no one should ever have to do this work without resources. And if it wasn't for national partnerships that we have all over the country, including at a federal level and in DC, you know, Justice LA would have had a much harder time. We leveraged every piece of support that we could, and we want to continue to be that support for others. And thanks to the work, especially of people like Yvette, Danielle, and Michelle, have created like a clearinghouse of templates that can be exported to help people do that initial lift. Sometimes just figuring out how you're going to format it to then present it is the hardest part. And so we wanted to make sure we have that in place to offer to people to make that formatting question easier, to get that first step out of the way. So we're also here for that. Justice LA exists to be a clearinghouse of resources for people and tools so that they can get those lifts going. And so that they're coming in armed with some of those policy briefs that look the right way, they might land the right way, that might make you feel more armed. And so just letting you know that everything we're talking about is also here to be offered to folks in partnership and in support, because like I said, like there is no way to do this if we're consistently kind of put on an island. And we know that Bakersfield and Kern County are of real significance in this struggle and really important places. And we want the rest of the country to understand that.
Yeah, Alex, and speaking of templates, I dropped in Justice LA's Care First budget report, and I'm going to drop in my email as well. So if folks want an example of what a policy memo or a policy brief looks like, I'm happy to send those along.
Thank you all. This is a great question and answer session. Any last remarks from the panelists about the questions that came up? We will be moving to a call to action, which I know came up in some of the questions, but just want to open up in case there's any final remarks. Great. So I just want to reiterate for those of you that have joined us that this, as the panelists have said, is not a one-off webinar. This is intended to be a series where we will continue to dive more deeply into these issues and these conversations and get more local and be able to have more time discussing things like data. And also all of the questions that were asked today will be addressed more deeply also down the line. So please be on the lookout for further webinars that you can join us for. So for our final section of our webinar today, I want to hand it over to our Bakersfield partners that are organizing on the ground locally to share with you calls to action and ways that you can get directly involved in the work. So Josh or Dalton, if you want to, or Yusidra, whoever wants to take it away. Yusidra, I see you unmuted, but I cannot hear you.
Are we there?
Yep.
All right. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and wanting to know more, to join this movement, to join the conversation and be a part of this transformative change. Come out to All of Us or None meetings, future webinars. You can find us on social media. It's All of Us or None Facebook group page for Bakersfield chapter. We're also on Twitter, All of Us or None Bakersfield, and our website is allabosornonebakersfield.com. You can also stop by our office at 948 Baker Street, 93305. Come out, use your voice. Be creative, be strong. Know that you are not alone, and it's going to take togetherness. It's going to take community to change this. Okay? Thank you, guys.
Dalton, you're muted.
Hey everyone, my name is Dalton. Like I said earlier, I organize with Faith in the Valley Kern, as well as the People's Budget, where we've been doing a lot of the policing and defunding the police specifically. Work is in the People's Budget with Yusidra and Josh, as well as a bunch of other people. I think someone is also on the call here who's helped us out a lot. But yeah, if you want to help out, if you want to help us out to get, the police defunded and divest the funds from there so we can actually put it into Black neighborhoods and brown neighborhoods, help us out. Here is, I put our MOU in the chat. It's basically just like, you agree with this, like you're down, let's do it, let's work together. If I missed anything, Josh, let me know.
Yeah, I think the only part that I would add to what both of my wonderful friends first and colleagues, I guess second, Cedar and Dalton have said is just that, and it's Joey. I think Joey was the one who whatever. Joey recognized Joey's name from some of our meetings with people's budget. Anyway, on top of all this, I mentioned in the beginning that the Department of Justice was just spent 3 years investigating the Sheriff's Department, and there's a whole host of demands that have come out of that settlement. And now Sheriff Youngblood, in his very sneaky way, is trying to figure out ways to circumvent having to carry the accountability and make the reforms necessary within that settlement agreement. And we can talk more about the specifics and what that looks like. But that is something that needs a lot of eyes because it was released throughout winter break, which is something that we've experienced before in Kern County. So also, the police department here locally in Bakersfield is still under investigation, and so we're anticipating sometime shortly that report or settlement or agreement to be released soon as well. Assuming that some of the similar things are settled on, we're going to have to make sure that the police chief, the sheriff, and all law enforcement not only doesn't use this as a way to advocate budget increases at the expense of every other department that's receiving cuts because of the current pandemic, but also to make it into an opportunity to actually have some accountability with teeth, like countless people on this call have been able to create, but also countless people throughout the country. So just looking for further collaboration. And if you come across some things that are just, hey, reach out to either Isidra or some of the folks at People's Budget or Faith in the Valley or ACLU. We're always willing. We know that we're not experts, and there's always more information to find and to learn. And so, reach out and stay in touch. Thanks.
Thank you all for sharing that information. And yes, so that concludes our webinar for today. As I've said before, this is the first in a series, so please be on the lookout and feel free to get in touch with the panelists that have shared their contact information here to learn more and become more active in this movement towards alternatives to incarceration. And yes, thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your Monday. Enjoy your week, and we will see you at the next webinar.